This is the most popular brushed car on Amazon Prime, and this is the most popular brushless car on Amazon Prime. Together, they represent almost 30,000 monthly sales. In today's video, we're gonna find out why that is and if these cars are actually worth buying. This is the Hiboxing or HBX 18859, and with over 20,000 sales in the last 30 days and a 4.5-star rating, this thing must be at least pretty good, but let's dig into it and see why it's rated so highly and why they're selling so many of them. This is claimed to be 1/18th scale, and as you can see, it is significantly smaller than a 3S Typhon Grom. It's got a fairly generic looking body, and it has a brushed motor with a brushed 2-in-1 ESC. As you can see here, this is mostly constructed of plastic, and the parts that are metal aren't really doing much because it doesn't even have oil in the shocks. These shocks do have metal shafts, so we might be able to put oil in them. We'll find out about that in just a minute. HBX makes some pretty well-known cars, including the 16889 Pro, which before the Groms came out was my recommendation for a small basher. Of course, that recommendation has since been superseded by the Groms. As you can see here, we just have a standard self-tapper to hold the wheel on. This wheel and tire is very small, there's no foam in it. It feels medium hard, and I suspect on a car this small, it should be fine. That self-tapper is going through a 12mm plastic hex, and that hex is going into a non-standard style stub axle. That's because this stub axle is plastic. The CVD itself is metal, but the stub axle and the output cup appear to be plastic. As we go through this, I am going to be fairly critical of it because in this same $80, $90, $100 price range, there are a lot of options, and I suspect there might be better options than this one. Of course, like I said, this thing has a great rating with a ton of reviews, so it has to be at least pretty good. In the rear, we have a similar setup, except for these are dog bones back here, and a fairly standard looking hub arrangement. We do have bearings in here, which is nice to see. At this quality level, bushings wouldn't have been terribly surprising. Now let's pull one of these shocks off and see if we can get some oil in it. While I'm taking this off, if you enjoy technical deep dive teardowns, now's a great time to get subscribed. We've got some really awesome cars coming in the future and some builds you're not going to want to miss. Seeing the way this is put together with Phillips screws on the top, I suspect we're not going to be able to put oil in this, but there's only one way to find out for sure. Pop this cap off of here. And yeah, unfortunately, there really is no way to put oil in here. It doesn't look like it has any seals anywhere. So this is going to remain a friction style or essentially undampened shock. It does have a threaded body though, which is kind of nice. Overall, I'll say so far the build quality on this feels reasonable for what it is. You can see here we do have a small brushed motor with a heat sink on it. This again is a 2-in-1 ESC. It does have a 3-wire servo, and that means you can upgrade the servo if you want to, but let's take a look at this stock one. To finish getting this out of here, let's get this battery out of the way. As you can see here, we've got a 7.4 volt, 850 milliamp hour LiPo battery. This does come with 2 of them, which is nice to have because the included charger is going to be fairly slow. The servo does appear to have some attempt at waterproofing, which I'm glad to see because the manual does say that it is splash waterproof. This does appear to be a fairly comprehensive manual. We've got pictures of all the parts, instructions on how to use the radio, and everything else you would expect. And now we'll pull these teeny tiny screws out of here. Okay, so unfortunately, one of these screws came stripped right out of the factory, but we don't have O-rings on these screws, and pulling this apart, I don't think there's any seals in here either. So whereas this will be splash resistant, it definitely isn't going to be waterproof. One big surprise though is looking in here, at least this output gear is brass. I don't want to pull this apart because I might not be able to get it back together again, but I'm surprised to see anything but a plastic geared servo in here. That's a nice touch. We've got a steel hex-shaped center drive shaft here, and I'm really curious to see what kind of differentials that's driving. Let's get this cover pulled off. There are definitely quite a few screws to take out in order to get to this differential. They're all self-tappers though, which means they come out pretty quickly. So even if you don't have power tools, this shouldn't be too terribly difficult to work on. Though I will say there are quite a few different sizes of screws here. Just got 2 more to go. And now this cover should lift off of here. As you can see, we have a steel pinion gear, but a plastic spur gear. We've got no slipper clutch, and it appears as though we've got an all plastic differential here too. These steel dog bones do look pretty beefy, and I expect they won't be the weak point in the system. Now let's pop this little differential apart and see what's inside. Opening this up, we can see we have all plastic gears inside, as well as some grease. This looks a lot like the stock differentials on the brushed Groms. As a matter of fact, all of this kind of looks like the stock differential on a brushed Grom. Interesting. Now, speaking of interesting, I'm really curious to see why 20,000 people a month love this thing so much, so let's get this thing put back together. One thing I noticed while putting this thing back together is whereas everything is pretty low end, it all feels pretty tight. There's not a huge amount of slop in anything, which means this thing's probably going to handle pretty well. To control that handling, we have a very basic transmitter. I've never seen this transmitter before, and whereas the throttle feels pretty good, the steering has a lot of tension on it, and overall it doesn't feel like a great transmitter. Hopefully it doesn't have a bunch of delay, because that's one of the biggest problems we see with these really low-end systems. Of course, there's only one way we're going to be able to find out. Let me get these stickers on here. Let's go see how fast this thing is, then take it for a blast. All right, fully charged 2S power. Let's see what this thing can do. It's not very fast. Full throttle. Yeah, it's pretty slow. It doesn't handle very well either. One more try. All right, let's see what that was. Okay, 16 miles an hour. That's pretty much what I expected. Let's see if this thing bashes better than its speed runs. Guys, so that was a run in what I would expect to be a typical setting for something like this, someone's backyard. I'm gonna give you my final thoughts on this at the end of the video. Let me know what your thoughts on that run were down in the comments though. But for now, let's take a look at that brushless option. Now this is the Hypergo H16PL, and not only does this thing represent a massive upgrade in specs, but you get a ton of extras with it. You get an extra battery, an extra body, an extra set of tires, an extra set of springs, an extra set of CVDs, and an extra differential. That's a lot of added value. Hypergo call this a 1/16 scale buggy, and whereas it is still a little bit smaller than the Arrma Typhon Grom, it's getting a little bit closer to the same size. That being said, it's what's under the hood of this that really differentiates it from the last vehicle we looked at. We've got a bigger battery, a full brushless system with a separate receiver, oil-filled shocks, which we'll take a closer look at in a minute, adjustable turnbuckles, all steel CVDs in the front and in the rear, and an overall stronger feeling chassis, though again, we're still dealing with Phillips self-tappers here. The battery on this is their Angry Snail 2000 milliamp hour 2S LiPo, and we do get 2 of those. That's powering a fairly generic looking 45 amp ESC, and we do have a fan and heatsink on the motor that goes with it. These wheels and tires will obviously be a big step up. They're held on by standard wheel nuts. And behind those, we have standard 12mm hexes with some pretty thick stub axles. These stock buggy tires on turbine wheels appear to have foams in them, but what's really cool is they include these other tires that are quite a bit bigger. They're also foam filled. We'll probably be running these when we bash it. Behind these wheels, things do look fairly similar to the HBX we just looked at, and that's because so many of these small vehicles are made off basically the same platform that they share some pretty serious design similarities. These wheel nuts look nice. They're both nylock and serrated, so they shouldn't be falling off. And we'll pop this last wheel off here, and then we're going to take a deep look at what's going on under the hood. Hypergo do make a few different vehicles on this same platform. I have previously run their monster truck, which is pretty good, but I've never messed with their buggy before, so I'm really curious to see how this thing runs, how it handles, and how it compares to the new Typhon Grom, as well as the new Relarlo that just came out. And here we have hybrid metal plastic threaded body shocks. These are oil filled. They feel nicely dampened. They've got some pretty good shafts on them, and it doesn't look like any of them are leaking. And they even come with little shock protectors, which is nice on a buggy because they tend to get scraped up pretty badly in upside down crashes, which we're probably going to have in just a few minutes. I suspect we're going to be dealing with just standard bladder style shocks here, but there's only one way to find out. And yeah, we've got little bladders here, and we've got a little reinforcement plate here, which is interesting. That probably stops the bladder from getting squished up into the top of the shock, and these feel pretty much full of fluid, which is really nice to see. We'll go ahead and get this put back together off camera, then we're going to dig deeper. This does have a pretty solid looking front bumper on it. A lot of buggies don't really have much of a front bumper, but for the size of this vehicle, this is actually pretty decent. It doesn't look super flexible, but it's nicer than not having it at all. Now that I feel this, I'm really surprised. This is metal. This is probably a cast zinc. I think it's interesting they're using metal for this. They've incorporated the front hinge pin A blocks into it, which means this is going to be a pretty strong piece, though it's going to transmit a lot of shock load into the chassis in crashes. A lot of people aren't going to have a skinny Phillips bit that's going to reach down into some of these holes. That is a bit of a disappointment because if they had gone with standard hex hardware, that wouldn't be a problem. And standard hex hardware would cost them just a few more cents and would make this thing feel a lot more premium, especially for its price. I do think it's interesting that the two best-selling RC cars on Amazon Prime both have Phillips screw hardware. I guess the people that buy them must not care that much. As I'm taking this apart, I can definitely feel the shared DNA between this and the previous car we looked at. There are a lot of differences, but you can tell they're based on the same platform for sure. This is a little bit of a design annoyance. These two screws are trapped underneath this shock tower, which means I've got to take this shock tower off, which is 4 more screws to go ahead and get this differential out of here. I feel like they could have designed it to where that wasn't necessary. Take this off and we should just have 2 more screws. Now all this should come off at once, giving us a good look at that differential. And even though we do have metal gears here, this looks like this is going to be cast zinc, not steel. Taking a magnet to it, we can see the magnet doesn't stick. This is interesting because this is what people are actually referring to when they say monkey metal. Monkey metal or pot metal typically refers to a cast zinc or some sort of mixture alloy that's going to be a lot softer than steel and have a much lower melting point. You could melt this with a propane torch. This is different from something like sintered steel, which is what Traxxas and a lot of other companies use on their lower end gears. This is sintered steel, and as you can see, a magnet does stick to it, whereas sintered steel isn't quite as strong as CNC machine steel. It's still definitely stronger than something like cast zinc, and when done properly can be nearly as strong as CNC machine steel. Of course, it has to be done properly. Okay, I hear you. Put my money where my mouth is. Let's see if we can melt this gear. We're just going to put it in this vise here, and this is a regular propane torch. We're going to start heating this thing up, and as you see, this thing is not going to start glowing red. It's just going to start melting. There we go. It's starting to melt down now. And this is a zinc alloy material with a very low melting point. Even aluminum would be difficult, if not impossible, to melt with this propane torch. So this is definitely a zinc alloy, or what you would call monkey or pot metal. Now, putting this Traxxas sintered steel gear in here, you can see there's going to be a very big difference. As we heat this up with the propane torch, it's definitely going to get hot, and you'll even be able to see it start glowing red, glowing orange, almost white. But this isn't going to melt because this is steel, and you can't melt steel with a propane torch. So there we go. This is monkey or pot metal. This is sintered steel. Let's get back to the review. We can see we've got some big beefy output cups here. And then taking a look inside, we can see that whereas this is grease filled, this is filled with all metal gears as well. One nice thing about this is you can get full steel differentials for pretty much any of these cars because again, they all kind of run on the same platform and there's a ton of different variations of these vehicles. It would be nice for this to come with steel gears out of the box, but this is how it comes and this is how we're going to test it. Taking a look at these CVDs, these things are really beefy and are far bigger than they need to be for this particular car, I think. These are the same type of CVDs they're using in some much larger vehicles. These definitely won't be the weak point, especially with this small power system. And then looking in the manual, we can see in the rear, we also have a zinc spur gear that's going to be combined with a steel pinion gear, and that's going to be running a plastic servo. Will that plastic servo be able to handle these larger tires? Will this standard MJX transmitter have any lag in it? Let's get this thing put together and find out. Now, you know, even though these didn't come on the car out of the box, they came with the car, and there's nothing I like more than a buggy with big truck tires, so you know we got to put these on. Even with all the extras, I'm still not convinced this is the best buy on Amazon for a brushless car, but hey, maybe a bash will change my mind. All right, let's see how brushless does. Oh, she's kind of hard to control. Oh, she's not responding, and I've lost control. So unfortunately, there's either something wrong with the transmitter or the receiver, because once I get about 15 feet away, this thing pretty much stops working. Fortunately, this thing has a separate receiver, so I can go ahead and pop it off of here and swap in my own. Obviously, if you had this problem, you would just be returning this and getting another one. But let's see if we can put a different receiver in here and finish the testing. Okay, now let's see if we can get a speed run out of this thing. That feels a lot better, although the ESC still feels laggy. Full throttle. That's reasonably stable. One more pass. All right, let's see what we got. 26 miles an hour, that's a lot better. Let's see if that extra speed translates to extra excitement in the backyard. Okay guys, I've definitely got a few things to say about both of these. First, let's talk about the most popular brushed truck on Amazon Prime right now. This thing's about 90 bucks and it doesn't feel like 90 bucks. This feels like what 90 bucks would have been a few years ago, but today for around the same price you can get something like the Hypergo MEW4, which is going to be brushless, have a lot more power than this, have oil-filled shocks, and quite a few more upgrades that you're just not going to get on this truck. Is this a bad little truck? No. If you buy this, will a little kid have fun with it? Sure. Do I think that its rating is primarily caused by people who don't have experience in the hobby and think this is really good? Almost certainly. I also want to mention that you're really not that far away from getting a brushed Grom when you're in this price range. And with the Grom, you get a lot of benefits. You're going to get better support. It's easier to work on. Upgrades are readily available. Parts are going to be available for a long time. And overall, even though this is the most popular brushed RC on Amazon Prime right now, I wouldn't recommend it. Speaking of things I probably wouldn't recommend, the Hypergo Buggy. This thing costs a bit more, but that also pushes it up into a higher price range with more competition. You've got the Relarlo ROG1, the new Relarlo Buggy, and for not a crazy amount more money, a 223S Typhon. And this is the thing that's really gonna kill pretty much all cars like this in my book. This car's fine, but the ESC is laggy. The receiver didn't work out of the box. That might be a one-off thing, but I can only review the car that I got. The tires are terrible. The suspension tuning isn't great, and the car just doesn't handle very well. In a vacuum, this thing's probably fine, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a world where for 40 more bucks, you can get a Typhon 223S, which is a far superior vehicle. So in conclusion, I would say if you're in the market for an RC car, or hey, anything on Amazon, make sure you're looking at the most legitimate reviews you can find for them. Make sure you compare them to other things, because there might be better options out there for not much more money, and you might be getting a much better value for your money with something like this. Speaking of value for money, we do videos like this all the time, and subscribing is absolutely free. It doesn't get much more valuable than that. Once you're done subscribing, why don't you check out one of these videos?